Olá, sou a Mariana Alvim, bem-vindos ao Vale a Pena, o meu podcast onde conhecemos as pessoas enquanto leitores, com o apoio da WUC, a maior livraria online portuguesa. Fiquem por aí, vale a pena. Katherine Vaz is the author of 3 novels, Saudade, a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Selection, congratulations for that, Mariana, published in 6 languages and picked by the Library of Congress as one of the top 30 international books of 1998. Wow, Mariana Alcoforado. And Above the Salt, A Linha do Sal, now also in Portuguese, and we'll get to this one, your last book. Katherine also wrote short stories, published in several children's stories which have appeared in anthologies. Among other honors, you had a citation by the Portuguese American Leadership Council of the U.S. as one of the all-time most influential women of lusa heritage. Wow.
Very nice to receive that one, yes.
Yeah, of course. Daughter of a father from Açores and an Irish mother, you won scholarships from the Harvard University and Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, from National Endowment for the Arts, and a Harman Fellowship. Wow. Is this all correct?
It apparently is. I look at that and I think, who did all that? But I guess it's me.
You live in New York City with your husband, Christopher Surf, an Emmy and Grammy-winning TV producer, composer for Sesame Street, editor and author. Rua Sésamo, we have it in Portugal.
In fact, when I travel in Portugal with my husband, Chris, people will come over and say, "Oh, I loved your show when I was growing up. Thank you." So he's very touched by that.
That's great. It's our childhood.
Yes, yeah. It was everyone's childhood.
Exactly. So we have a friend in common, Tânia Ganho. She translated your book, your last book, A Linha do Sal. And so, of course, I had to ask for her help in order to get more information on you. Mm-hmm. So I know you live in New York City, near the Metropolitan Museum, where you love to go on numerous occasions.
It's right on our street, so we're very lucky that we walk right up to the entrance and in we go.
So not quite vegetarian because you eat fish, but you avoid eating meat, or you don't eat meat at all.
I don't, but I gosto de peixe. And I also want to say I'm delighted to know Tânia as well. It was a real joy to watch her process in translating my book. In English, it's Above the Salt, and A Linha do Sal in Portuguese. And we've become good friends. We hosted her when she was in New York and had a lovely time. So I just want to thank her very much also for facilitating all the publicity I'm doing now in Portugal for my book. And it's very exciting. And it's a real honor to be on your amazing show, because I've heard so much about it.
Oh, thank you. Tânia also came here as a guest.
Yeah, well, she's also a wonderful novelist. And I, first of all, apologies to your listeners that I'm speaking in English just because it is easier for me, but I do read Portuguese for maybe an hour every morning just to be in touch with the language. Wow. I think language is a country of its own, and so I like to go in there. But I also want to thank you for letting me express myself in English, because it's still easier for me.
Yeah, of course. We had that in mind, and Tânia also told me that you were able to speak in Portuguese, but it would be best for you, and I want you to be at ease. So.
Yes,
and our listeners, Portuguese people speak English, so it's okay. And I will put the subtitles on YouTube for those who prefer. But so Tânia said that you have a colorful style, eccentric but in the good way, a romantic. Mm-hmm. And once you wore a pair of shoes when you went to a book event, and that you said were made by a friend of yours.
I'm trying. Oh, yes. Well, that was a wonderful story because I broke a toe when I was traveling. I didn't put a light on at night, and I hit my toe. And this friend of mine made me these gorgeous slippers with sequins and ribbons. And so to accommodate that, because it was right before my lançamento of my book in in New York. So she made me these beautiful slippers that went with that. Yeah.
Sequences lentejoulas.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Great. So you're a good friend, and wherever you go, you always find a way to see them. You just came back from a 4-day wedding from California. That's why you have henna in your hand. It's beautiful.
I do have. I'm a very, very proud tia and madrasta of the groom. And so we did, it was 4 days of ceremonies, including, as you can see,
Yes,
I'm sorry, your listeners can't see my henna.
When we'll take a picture, you'll show your hand.
Okay, yes, of henna, which I'm delighted is still on my hand.
It's beautiful. So now your books. Before A Linha do Sal, we have in Portuguese Mariana, the life of Mariana Alcoforado. You want to talk a little bit about this book?
Yes, it was a labor of love. I went to Beja, it's now 20 years ago that I went, and I did a very funny thing when I showed up. I had read about Mariana through Rilke, the German writer, who was, of course, adored, the poet.
Yeah.
And he mentioned Mariana. And a friend of mine said, oh, this sounds like something that would be interesting for you. So when I went to Beja, the church, the convent with the museum was locked. It was shut. So I went to City Hall and I said, oh, please, I've come all the way from California. At the time, I was living in California, not New York. And they got Leonel Bajela, who worked there and was a huge Mariana fan, to unlock the door for me. Now, I didn't tell them I'd actually come from Lisbon. I said, oh, I've come all the way from New York, from California. But they let me in, and it began this odyssey of discovery. And the Bojela family took me in and showed me all their paper and possessions about Mariana. And I wasn't sure how to tell the story. And as you might know, and as your listeners might know, up until then, most of the things written about Mariana Alcoforado were about, was she real or was she invented by a Frenchman who invented the letters and so forth? And I thought, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to tell a novel of her life, whether it's fiction or true, and I believe it's true. And there's enough evidence that you find to suggest there was indeed a Mariana Alcoforado who lived there. So I didn't quite know how to tell the story for an American audience. And, there were a lot of funny, strange things that happened when I was writing this. My first night where I decided I was going to do the book, for example, this is very weird. My husband and I, suddenly the light got turned on in our room. We didn't know how that had happened. Wow. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's a little scary.
Sign.
Yes, and I thought that's a sign. So, my father was from the Azores, and so I was taught to look for signs. So that, and very recently, the exciting news about Mariana is that Aza, Leia, has reissued a brand new, beautiful copy of that book, a new edition. And there is a wonderful woman in London whose name is Sandy Welsh, who's done a lot of adaptations for the BBC, like Emma and Jane Eyre and all sorts of wonderful things. And she's adopting that now into a script. So, vamos ver. Vamos ver.
That's great. So it's a series or a movie? Probably a series.
I'm waiting to find out myself.
Okay.
I'm waiting to find. My guess is it would be a series because that's more popular now. But she's doing her thing. It's a new creation, and I'm excited to see what happens.
Wow, and it's a classic already. So if she's done Jane Eyre and all, that's great.
She has, and she's very good with, you might say, what's called costume dramas or older stories, romantic stories that are real. And she has a certain ability to make characters seem very alive and a little bit different from the telling of most of them without modernizing it so much that you feel like that it's so apparent that it's modern. So she's a lovely person, and I'm excited to see what happens.
Great. Mariana Alcoforado, soon to be on television. Let's see then what happens. So your latest book, congratulations. It's beautiful, it's poetic, and it's sad and romantic, also based on real events. I'm Portuguese, and I know since ever that people from Madeira immigrated to the United States, but I didn't know why it began. So this is, I learned a lot from your book. which is great. And I didn't even, I acknowledged my ignorance because I never thought of it, actually.
Well, that's been the most wonderful thing about the 15 years it took to do this book. It really began when I was doing a talk at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and I had the honor of them recording some of my work for the archives of the Hispanic Division there as the first person of Portuguese ancestry to have published work put in the archives. And it just so happened that there was an exhibit in the map room of something called the Portuguese Protestants of Illinois, which was very funny, and I'd never heard of it. And the wonderful friend I had there, who was herself from Brazil, Dr. Aida Chiqueira Wiarda, said, why don't you look into that a little bit? And so that began the long, long voyage of finding out about this colony of people. And my career has had a lot to do with sharing for an English-speaking, English-reading audience some of the stories of Portuguese in America and the immigration and Portuguese culture. Of course, Mariana is set exclusively in Portugal, but it's to bring to English speakers or readers more Portuguese things, because my father, who was from the Azores, as you mentioned, pointed out to me when I was a child that there was a lack of that on the literature landscape in America. So A Linha do Sol is, you might say, a continuation of my hoping to give as a gift these stories. I'll tell you briefly what happened was, in the 19th century, there was a Scottish missionary, Dr. Robert Reed Calley, who went to Madeira and converted not just a small number of people, not a few dozen. Estimates are from a few hundred up to maybe 2,000, which, of course, on an island of that size is quite a lot. And he converted them to Presbyterianism. What doesn't get said usually in the story about him is that he was somebody who came and built schools to educate women and girls. He gave away free medicine because he was actually a physician, and but he ran afoul of the church, and the Presbyterians were blamed for a drought, and they were driven off the island. There was a call on the pulpits one day to drive them into the sea, and they spent 2 years in Trinidad. That's only a very tiny mention in the book, because you can go down all sorts of avenues in a long book, and sometimes you have to cut them short. But they were adopted by Springfield and Jacksonville, Illinois, at the time of Abraham Lincoln. And this, to me, was an extraordinary example of American generosity. They were given land, they were given jobs, mostly labor and domestic jobs. There's an asterisk here that's important. They were also a very good-sized voting bloc to join, because they were abolitionists. Calley was very staunchly anti-enslavement and an abolitionist. And so were all the rest of these people. So they were aligned, and they were Protestant. And you might say the kind of religious difficulties in Madeira were reversed in the United States, because at that time there was an anti-Catholic feeling there. So all these things that we still live with today. So I followed in particular the story of a man named John Alves, because there was a newspaper article in which he, as an old man, goes back to the Lincoln household, and he recalls with such emotion courting someone in that home, the home of the Lincolns, named Mary Freitas, which, of course, as Portuguese listeners know, is a little bit like saying Jane Smith in English.
Maria Freitas.
Yeah. But he was so overcome by those memories as an old man going back that he couldn't sign his name.
He was shaking.
He was shaking so much. And I thought, what kind of love story, what kind of emotion is that? And that kept me going, trying to capture the emotion of this man, recalling that, what happened. And that blank space is where I wrote my long novel.
Yeah, and it's great. And why did it take you 15 years?
There were a lot of missteps. There were a lot of, it's so gratifying to see a finished book, and it's all between two covers. But I threw out hundreds of pages. I went down, I went on tangents that I cut. I needed to add things. I needed to find out who these people were. It's just so your listeners know, it's a love story on the top of a book about war. It's about war and peace, but it's also a love story about three people in particular. It's a love triangle, so if you like those.
I do.
And one of the most wonderful things about the book so far has been, I have a poetic style, but I worked very hard to make sure that the story moved, that the plot does things you don't expect, that make sense but are maybe a surprise, and that you don't know where the story is going till we get to the end. And I've gotten a lot of letters saying, oh, it was a really exciting story. You have a very poetic style. It's a poetic book, but I kept reading. And the editor in America who bought it, my agent sent it to her and a couple of other editors and I thought, well, go do something else for a while because it's a long book. It's going to take a while to hear things. I heard from my editor the next morning because she'd been up all night reading it. So I thought, oh my gosh, that's like a dream scenario for a writer. But then I worked an extra year trying to refine the story and their characters with her. I worked a long time with her to get it where it is right now.
Wow, and mission accomplished because you have it all here. You have the information, you have the twists, you have me going to decipher what's happening because you don't guess. It's a surprise, and it's lyrical and it's poetic. And I started underlining a few sentences, but then I realized I was in a hurry to read it because I wanted to interview. After. So I underlined a few sentences, and since you speak Portuguese,
I do my best. Yes,
you do. Yeah, I'm gonna ask you to read, a couple of them. I'm not gonna, but there are a few. There's one image that it was only in the beginning, and I loved it. And you said, but you're gonna read it. You said, because when it's cold and we speak, white comes out of our mouth. So you said,
yes,
cold is white, and I thought that was beautiful.
Yeah, these were people. I did do a lot of wonderful research for this book, and I went to Madeira and. What struck me is, of course, it's a subtropical climate. It's warm, it's lush, it's humid, it's very colorful. These people went to Illinois where it's icy and flat and it snows, and they would not have seen their breath coming out of their mouths as white till they were in a cold climate like that. So everything was new.
It was great. So now, before going to that sentence, I'm going to ask you to read. It's the underline, these two sentences.
Sure. Maria Catarina Pereira Vaz Gato de Freitas está parada com o pai e muitas desconhecidas numa colina. Atrás deles, as marés ondulam.
As marés.
As marés ondulam da mesma maneira que a pele dela quando ouve música. Quando o pai canta, como faz nesse momento, fitas de notas desenrolaram-se e ela junta-se e ele, enquanto uma soprano, canta como uma feiticeira. O dia inteiro é uma canção. I hope I did all right.
Yeah. I'm just going to get that sentence. It's small, but I have several, but this is it. The one I mentioned about the white.
Okay. This is when, of course, John and some of the other refugees arrive in Illinois.
Exactly.
Yes. As carruagens eram abertas e achatadas, e o ar tão gélido que as palavras saíam brancas da boca de toda a gente. O frio é branco. Os sons têm cores.
Os sons têm cor. It's beautiful. Okay, I have a lot of more underlined, but we'll leave it to the listeners to buy and read.
There you go.
A linha do sal, which is you have a triangle, but congratulations! It's a great achievement in 15 years. Wow.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a labor of love too, because at times when I paused with writing the book and think, oh, it's so much, I don't know if I can go on, I would think of that trembling hand, and I would think of fall back in love with your characters. That's the thing to do.
Yeah, I fell in love with your character. Well, not John's mother.
John's mother could be tough, but she tried to redeem herself in the end. So, yeah.
Don't say it.
No, I won't give it away. I won't give it away.
She was the only one I was like, but okay. I won't say anymore. So, you are friends with Meg Wolitzer, Elizabeth Strout, Tayari Jones. And when I asked with whom you would have dinner with, you said Alice Munro.
Yes, because I know that I can call up these other friends and have dinner with them anytime.
Exactly.
So it's difficult to just pick one. But Alice Munro, of course, died very recently. And I thought it was fascinating. You know, you sent me those questions when I was in New York, and she hadn't died that long ago. And she was the first name that came into my head as somebody I wish I could bring back to sit down and talk with. She was a hero for a lot of women in particular, about telling stories her own way and about letting people know that stories exist in places and with people and on landscapes that at first glance we don't see them. And she took the pages she needed, she took the twists and turns she needed to do that. She seemed to be so much her own person. She created a style that was her own. So I think just emblematically, and she also just seems like a lot of fun. I mean, we don't have to talk about writing. It would be just fun to sit down with her and just, she seems like somebody who would be fun to chat with.
To hang out.
Yeah, to hang out with, yeah.
So for those who don't know her literature, any book in particular you recommend to start?
Any of her short stories, any of her collections of short stories. She writes about the Canadian landscape as if it's a person. And a story I like in particular is The Bear Went Over the Mountain. That's a story I just love. Okay. And I cannot, as many times as I read it, I always cry at the end of that story.
Wow. Okay. I'm writing it down.
So The Bear Went Over the Mountain, which is a song, of course. The Bear Went Over the Mountain, the Bear Went Over the Mountain. But it's a beautiful story. She's a tough person as a writer, but she also hits emotions in such a way that it's just absolutely uncompromised and brilliant.
Alice Munro. Okay, so now let's get to know you, Katherine Vash, as a reader. The writing, the awards, the book tours, even classes you teach, several friends throughout the world. When are you able to read?
I read at night and I read during breaks. I'm kind of a disciplined person. I'm a morning person. I get up early and I write first thing in the morning. I read an hour of Portuguese when I have my coffee in the morning, and it's a way of starting my day thinking. It's almost like on an airplane when they say, put your own oxygen mask on first before you take care of someone else's children. I do that. And so I feel calm. And I always try to have, a book that I'm engaged in reading. And I like the tempo of having other people's thoughts in my head, but I do my own work first. So I think being a reader is as important as being right. When I was young and I didn't have any money and I was in college, I thought, I'm going to say right now that I'm a writer. I'm not going to postpone it. And one contribution I made to the world at large was I would buy a literary magazine off. They had them on the newsstands back then, and to me it was a contribution to the arts and to someone else who had written something. So I thought that was important to say, I'm going to make a contribution to some other writer. I'm going to buy a book. I'm going to participate in the world that I've decided I belong to.
Wow. Okay, that's great. So now let's talk about the books you chose, which I know always it's a difficult question.
It is, yes, it is.
Beloved by Toni Morrison. Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993. And this book also won the Pulitzer Prize in 1988, and it was finalist to the National Book Award. And we have it in Portugal. Toni Morrison, also called Beloved.
Yes, I think that novel stunned me by the way she used language to convey pain, and that the closer she got to describing in clear language the trauma at the heart of that book, what had happened to
Sethi, an ex-slave that had to kill her baby daughter.
Yeah, she killed her child rather than have the child taken back into slavery. And when you first start the book, you're not sure what's going on. And there's a certain confidence in telling to the reader, don't be impatient, enter this world of pain and language that seems indefinite, because it's almost going to be washed clean. And as the knowledge of what happened to her got clearer, there was more madness entering in. In other words, the reality is so overwhelming. And I thought her ability to capture emotion using language, not by describing it, but by manipulating levels of understanding, was just absolutely brilliant. I've never gotten over that.
Wow. She doesn't describe, she makes you feel.
She makes you feel.
Beloved is it's the word written on a tombstone of her baby.
Yeah.
So this is Toni Morrison's enduring masterpiece. And Toni Morrison's real name is Chloe Anthony Ardelia Wofford. And so when she became a Catholic at the age of 12 and took the baptism of the Christian name Anthony after Anthony of Padua, which led to her nickname Toni.
I actually didn't know that. Yeah. Okay, that's wonderful to find out. Yeah.
Yeah, hence Toni Morrison. Among other important honors she received from President Barack Obama, he presented her with a Presidential Medal of Freedom of 2012. She received several awards and achievements, and she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2020.
Yeah, she's an example of a strong female voice as well, and I admired her. I admired how she created in a way, that Alice Munro sense of knowing who she was, knowing what she wanted to do, knowing how to create worlds that were her own.
Chloe Anthony Ardelia Wofford. Toni Morrison with Beloved. Another book you chose, which is one of the biggest classics of children's literature, read by thousands throughout the world. And it's great because sometimes people ask me about children's books. So you chose, and we have it also translated, Charlotte's Web, A Teia de Carlota, from E.B. White, Elwyn Brooks White.
Yes, E.B. White is really interesting, and your listeners may not know that when I was college age, we all had a manual that he had also written about style. And so his language is absolutely impeccable in its beauty and correctness. And so we all studied his manual about it. He's an elegant writer, but it's very understated. And so Charlotte's Web, to me, has one of the all-time best opening lines of any story ever written, which is, "Where's Papa going with that axe?" And so I think it's just a lovely story. And again, E.B. White is somebody who is very much a New Yorker. But he had a farm upstate, and he lived with animals. He took care of them. He allowed that care and that rhythm of just daily living to seep into himself. That's why Charlotte's Web is so good. It's because he didn't just come up from the city and spend a day on a farm and wrote this. He lived that. So it's a beautiful book, and he's not afraid to talk about death with children. And I always thought that was remarkable too.
Do you remember how old were you when you first read it?
Oh, I was young. I might have been 12. My parents were both big readers. My mother was a lover of books. My grandmother would give us one of the Wizard of Oz books. There are several. Every time she came to visit. So I grew up with that. And of course, I married a man whose dad was one of the founders of Random House and found Dr. Seuss. So that's another love of mine that I thought, when I was reading Cat in the Hat as a child, I never thought, well, I'm going to grow up and marry the son of the man who published this. But that's what happened.
Wow. And you said it was so you recommend, of course, Oz's books from L. Frank Baum's. Then we have Charlotte's Web. Going back to Charlotte's Web, you have, it's a pig, Wilbur, that he finds out that he's about to be the people's dinner.
Yeah.
So Charlotte's Web, Charlotte is a spider who helps him.
Yes.
So it's a friendship story.
It's a friendship story. And of course, it gives nothing away to say that, Charlotte dies in the end. And Wilbur, it's a wonderful story about the meaning of friendship and life. And it's got the whole universe in it, even though it's just this one seeming story for children. But it's also gives credit that children are sensible, mature, caring, full humans who can encompass all that. So I think E.B. White is a brilliant stylist as well. His prose is so elegant. His essays about New York City, where I now live, they're just breathtakingly beautiful. So, and he doesn't have a lot of flourishes or what we call fireworks in his writing. It's just Rodriguinhos. But he's has a confidence in language itself that's quite beautiful.
Okay. A Teia de Carlota, Charlotte's Web from E.B. White. So you also mentioned Dr. Seuss. We have the Lorax, the Cat in the Hat, you mentioned, and all the places you'll go, and green eggs and ham. And you said you had a story on this.
I do. Not many people know this because my sogro, Bennett Cerf, was the founder of Random House, and he had found Dr. Seuss, and he bet him $50 that he couldn't write a book that only used, I forget the number of words, like 27 or 50 words maximum. Whatever it was, I'm not sure. It was not very many.
And a challenge.
It was a challenge. So Dr. Seuss, whose real name was Theodore Geisel, said, okay, I'll take that bet. And he came back with green eggs and ham. And the rumor was that my father-in-law never paid him the money that he owed him. And Dr. Seuss would never forgot that and would write him notes about, I want my $50 or, whatever it was. So that's kind of a funny, wonderful little story. But it also signaled to me, now that I mention it, it was when publishing was a lot of fun. I mean, my father-in-law had a lot of fun publishing people. Like he did James Joyce, and there's a wonderful story about that too. And Gertrude Stein, very quickly on one of the flaps of Gertrude Stein's books, he wrote, I have no idea what Gertrude is talking about, but she says that's because I'm an idiot. So I hope you understand it. So they were real pals.
It makes sense.
Yeah. So it was. They had fun. They had a lot of fun.
And what about now? I'm curious about James Joyce's story. What is it?
Okay. Well, in brief, because it's a bit of a long story. As you might know, it was banned in the United States for obscenity, and rather than publish it, I mean, Random House was very new, and so my father-in-law went to Ireland. I think he paid Joyce $5,000 for Ulysses, and he hired someone to smuggle the book back in to get it through customs with the reviews about the worth of that book pasted into the copy, because you could only enter into evidence a book that had been seized itself, the physical copy. So he pasted in all these reviews about the literary merit into it. But now the funny part was, it apparently was a very, very hot day in New York when they were trying to smuggle it. And they were just waving him through, like, go on, go on, go on. And the guy panicked because he had to be arrested for smuggling this book, so it would go to court. So he said, I insist you look through my suitcase, open it up, I'm an American citizen, I demand you search my luggage. So he found the copy of Ulysses. He says, we don't care about that, everyone takes this in, go on. And he said, no, I insist you arrest me. So that was kind of a funny thing, and it was a famous court case, and my father-in-law was very clever about publicity and negotiations, and the copy was entered into evidence with all these reviews about its literary merit. It was a very liberal judge sitting in attendance, which my father-in-law had knew about ahead of time. And so it was allowed to be published, and the rest is history.
Wow, Ulysses, cool. That's a great story. So we have a lot of recommendations already. But we have to talk also George Eliot, Middlemarch.
Yes, I read that in college, and I will admit, I looked at the size of it and I thought, oh dear, what do I don't know about this. That was a book that surprised and delighted me with all the stories and the details and the humor about people. And I thought, this is like Jane Austen on steroids in a way. It was the volume of storytelling and the complications and the interweaving, and it was a real education to me for entering a world and entering consciousness of different characters and all the complications and the humor and her ability to spin a tale, that the interweaving of it, to me, was like this massive, elaborate Persian carpet. And I never got over that. And I try to reread it every 10 years. So I'm about due, I think, to reread it.
You know how it ends.
Yeah, but then I never mind finding out how a story ends. Like, I'm terrible about that, because then I can see how the pieces are put together to get there.
Okay. You read as a writer.
I do. Yeah, I do.
Of course. So these are like parallel stories, both becoming trapped, both Lydgate and Dorothea are trapped in unhappy marriages. However, their reactions to the realities of their situations are different.
Yes, and they work in tandem. So you can see how different people can deal with situations in different ways. And a lot of storytelling, a lot of things we enjoy about stories are the revelation of secrets. Or for example, Dorothea finally finds out she's married to someone who's never going to amount to much. And Casaubon is kind of a dry, angry, inward-turning person.
Yeah, so Edward Casaubon is the pedantic scholar.
He's a pedantic scholar, and it's funny as well, because, like, Dorothea, what did you think was going to happen? So they just seem like real people. And they don't seem set in time. They seem like somebody we could know in our own lives.
The guy next door.
The guy next door. And, I've been in academia as well, so you kind of see that, but it's all done with this kind of, it's not heavy. It's very beautifully handled. George Eliot has a thoughtful way of writing. She in a way that I appreciated more and more as I got older.
Okay. You know what Virginia Woolf said about this book? One of the few English novels written for grown-up people.
Oh, well, perfect. I didn't know about that quote, but that sounds about right.
Middlemarch by George Eliot. George Eliot, her name is Mary Ann Evans, and later she got married, so she got cross by marriage, her last name. You know that there's this information I got from her. She was a voracious reader and obviously intelligent. Because she was not considered physically beautiful, she was not thought to have much chance of marriage. So, and this, coupled with her intelligence, led her father to invest in an education not often afforded to women. That's terrible, and at the same time,
as we say now, unpacking that is so complicated, because it's combinations of awful, terrible, and also, when I was researching Mariana about these nuns, of course, I think people in Portugal are more apt to know than Americans, perhaps, that a lot of these girls were put in convents not because they had a vocation, but because their rich fathers wanted to give something back to the church, or they didn't want to divide their property among too many sons-in-laws. And these young women in a convent did it. But what was interesting to me is they had their own little city of women, and they were more educated, perhaps, than their sisters who had to get married. So it was the fate of women, and still is, that this complication about place in the world and questions of age and beauty and presence and fairness. There's so much. I mean, we could spend another hour talking about the problems with that. But that's another thing. I appreciated that George Eliot was a strong female author as well.
Middlemarch, written in 1871-72. So, I have a question for you. Beloved by Toni Morrison, Middlemarch by George Eliot, Charlotte's Web by de Carlota. Pick one. You also had, but we don't have much more time, but you also mentioned, of course, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabo.
That was, the maestro himself. That was the book that gave so many people, not just me, permission to tell the stories they had heard, as he said, from grandparents or parents that seemed marvelous or unreal and yet were more real than reality. You know, he's called a magical realist, but he himself said, there's nothing magical about it. I'm just reporting the facts. And he made metaphor operate as a real thing. And, you know, to me, it was permission to tell stories that I knew from my own childhood, from my father in the Azores. Like, you know, I remember very quickly, if I can, a woman was locked out of her house that was of Portuguese descent. My father sent me with a key to let her in. And I said, why didn't he just go to the neighbor and call us? Because the neighbor had seen her sitting in the yard and called my dad. And he said she doesn't know how to use a telephone because she couldn't identify numbers. She couldn't read or write Portuguese or English. And my father, out of nowhere, said, I think she thinks in color. So he made a placard of color dots, and he covered her phone with color paint to show how to help her dial the phone. And I thought that was a real thing. That wasn't some magical, fantastical little thing that I made up. That was real.
A smart scheme.
Yeah, but it was counts as kind of magical realism. And that's when I understood that. And much later, when I read 100 Years of Solitude, it was almost a permission to say, come on in, this is how we can tell stories.
Wow. 100 anos de solidão. We also have it translated into Portuguese. So now the question is, beloved, Middlemarch, 100 Years of Solitude, and Charlotte's Web. Pick one.
100 Years of Solitude.
Okay. I'm glad we mentioned that.
Yeah, as I would pick that as my number one book.
Okay. So now I have a surprise for you. I thought it was it could be risky, but I know that you read the PENA from Tânia Ganho, which is 700 pages book, and you read it. So I knew that you would be able to read in Portuguese, and you just said that I read
Portuguese
every morning
very well. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So this is funny because it's it's small for you to not get scared, but then I heard you read PENA. But your father is from Açores, your mother from Ireland, and one of the books you chose today is concerning slavery. So I discovered an author from Açores. He lived in Ireland, actually, and one of his books is about slavery. It's called Escrava Açoriana.
Obrigada. And in fact, Pedro Almeida Maia, I met the last time I was there.
And do you have that book?
I don't.
So
and I will happily read this.
Great.
And you know, so the Azores is a wonderful place. My mother, they met in California. My mom was actually born and raised in New York, and they met in California, where my father and his family had immigrated, and my mother moved there when she was young too. But I just met him not very long ago.
Pedro Almeida Maia.
Yeah, Pedro Almeida
What a coincidence.
Maia. So I would very happily read this. I not only have read Tanya's large book, but I started it again because it's a wonderful story, and her vocabulary is so rich that it's very good practice for me. So, thank you. I will look forward to reading this as well.
Okay. Well, thank you. It was a pleasure having you.
This was a great pleasure. I loved talking on your show, and thank you again for your patience with I was going to say my Portuguese as I came in prepared to stumble along, but I hope I expressed myself better in English. Of course. Mariana, it was a real pleasure and an honor to be on your wonderful show.
Thank you. Pleasure was all mine, and obrigada a quem ouve.
Obrigada.
Para a semana, há mais. Next week we have more. There.
Okay, I hope I did okay.
Of course you did.